With a whirlwind of statements around the annexation of Greenland by the U.S. and a possible tariff war between the superpower and its European allies, it is my pleasure to welcome back to the program Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who joins me to dig even deeper into the subject at hand. Ivana, thank you so much for joining me on World News tonight.
Always pleasure.
So, as we look at the whole scenario, what do you think this crisis, because we need to call it that at this point in time, is going to mean for the future of NATO? Is this a make it or break it situation? Are we finally arrived at this point?
I think it's too early to predict any doomsday scenario right now. What I agree with President Trump is that Greenland is very important for European security, for transatlantic security, for American security. However, the approach that President Trump is taking is not the wisest approach, because right now, with Russia and China trying to completely undermine the West and to completely rewrite the global order, the last thing that we need is to make our allies being upset at the United States. And that's precisely why I'm very concerned what's happening right now between Europe and the United States, but also about NATO writ large. And to zoom out, we were talking multiple times on your show how Russia has been trying to undermine NATO. And unfortunately, nowadays, NATO doesn't need external enemies if the enemies are already trying, to undermine it, but the allies inside the alliance are not united. And that's precisely what I see right now.
You mentioned that we shouldn't be jumping to conclusions. We shouldn't be focusing on doomsday scenarios, and I completely agree with you. But where is the point of no return in this whole scenario? I mean, by February 1st, if I'm correct, we're going to see tariffs reaching up to 10%. Then by June, there is a possibility of extension up to 25%. Where in this scenario are we going to see that there is no return?
President Trump has a long history of applying tariffs to boost American national security. And while, that's not, in my view, the right approach to approach with our allies, because make no mistake, Europe is going to retaliate. And that's already happening inside the EU. A lot of talks to impose additional countermeasures on the United States. And here is the thing. This really reminds me on how Russia is negotiating, because it reminds me very much on a lose-lose strategy, because neither the United States nor Europe are going to win. The only winners in this whole story will be Russia and China. And as I mentioned in the past, we have to really zoom out and to understand why President Trump is concerned about Greenland. And we have to put it in the context of the Arctic. Russia and China are already there boosting their national security efforts. We are talking about rare minerals. We are talking about the U.S. Military base. So I understand that part of the story. But what I do not understand is that Denmark has historically been our ally, and all President Trump has to do is to knock on a door there and to ask them for help, because as the United States is increasingly focusing on China, we will need allies in Europe also to counter China, especially if President Trump is concerned about the Arctic. And earlier today, I already saw that Russia is talking about U.S.-Russia cooperation in the Arctic, which would be a very bad sign. So that's precisely why I'm not happy really with economic war, because this is going to cause a lot of economic troubles in Europe, but also disappointments in the United States. So this is not a win-win game. This is truly a lose-lose game.
About what you just said, I would like to dig in deeper. You mentioned that Russia reached out to the U.S. with a possibility of cooperation in the Arctic. Do you think that President Donald Trump, as a businessman at heart, would actually agree to this?
I truly hope, that basically what Russia said, they believe, that as a relationship, it's in Russian media, as the relationship is improving, that they believe that the start of their cooperation might actually start in the Arctic. And that's an old Russian game, talking that peace through trade. Let's forget about, wars. Let's talk about economic cooperation. We can be allies. And that's a very wrong approach. President Trump is the core negotiator, business negotiator. And that might work really with real estate. The problem is applying such a strategy in the context of Russia, it will not work, because just look at what's happening between Russia and the United States negotiations on Ukraine. Russia has been pushing that envoy in the United States, constantly talking about economic cooperation, because Americans love to talk about business, about improvement, about that, win-win game. And Russia knows that. So that's precisely why I'm very concerned that some fractures, in Washington might fall for that Arctic cooperation. That would be a strategically tragic mistake for the United States. As a matter of fact, I do believe that Russia and China are going to start a new, what I like to call a global power competition in the Arctic and in the space in the coming years. And that's precisely why right now the United States should not fall for that. The United States should be very concerned about the Arctic, and that's precisely why we need allies in Europe to help us with that.
I would also like to shed some light on a possible European response to those tariffs that we've covered here extensively on the show. We know that there's going to be an extraordinary meeting of EU leaders that will take place on Thursday, January 22nd. And as we read I would like to bring a quote from the Financial Times. George Saravelos, Deutsche Bank's chief FX strategist, said, quote, "Europe is America's largest lender. European countries own $8 trillion of U.S. bonds and equities, almost twice as much as the rest of the world combined. From our perspective, the key thing to watch over the next few days will be whether EU decides to activate its anti-coercion instrument by putting measures that impact capital markets on the table." End quote. Could the U.S. gamble such assets in a scenario that they impose the tariffs and the situation escalates?
That's exactly, why earlier today I told you that I'm very concerned about this trade war, because there are no winners there. There will only be losers. And right now I understand why Europe has that approach, because they have been trying constantly to talk nicely to Washington, D.C., but there were tariffs, even in the past on the horizon. And Europe is kind of like a sick and tired of that approach, and they're trying to retaliate. So I understand that part. Why I'm a little bit, more hopeful probably than some other analysts, it's because still in the United States, there are a lot of people in the US government, in Congress, who might not be happy with further escalation when it comes to economy, because that will destabilize both European and American markets. So that's precisely why I think it's a wise thing to wait and see.
So this tariff discussion, I know that we are starting to run out of time, but I need to ask you about the Board of Peace. I mean, we've seen some invitations. We allegedly heard of the invitations being sent out to Vladimir Putin, to Alexander Lukashenko. We've also heard about Polish President Karol Nawrocki and other Western leaders being invited to this Board of Peace. Do you think that Donald Trump will be able to reshape the world order as we know it? And how does it stand in contrast to this whole tariff war, to the dominance in the Arctic, to a possible conflict on that scope with Russia? How does it play together? What's your opinion?
I'm really not very hopeful about that Board of Peace. I understand, again, the logic. The logic is to build such a informal basic institution that will bring, countries to sit together and to try, to prevent further wars. But I understand also why he invited Putin, as he's currently negotiating with Russia. But that's not going to really work, because if we are talking about reshaping the global order in China and Russia has been trying to divide it, that's precisely why right now we need a unity between Europe and the United States to stand together when it comes to peace and security in the world. There are a lot of research so far that is talking about potential further escalation in Europe, whether in the Baltic states, coming from Russia, or China taking over Taiwan. And that's precisely why dividing even further our allies is not going to work. I'm quite, certain that many European countries will reject such an invitation, which will basically put America only with allies in Europe, I don't know, such as probably Hungary and few other countries. And with all due respect, with friends such as Hungary, the United States doesn't need enemies, given that Hungary has been a close ally to both Russia but also China.
Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, was my guest on the show. Ivana, pleasure as always to have you back.
Thank you very much for a kind invitation.
Thank you. And so this would be all for now. Thank you for joining me. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.